colleague and dear friend, Mr. Vincent Fluellen, who is our Chief Diversity Officer for the university worldwide. Now, Mr. Fluellen will describe some of the steps the university has taken following the tragic murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Trayvon Martin, Eric Gardner, Amadou Diallo, and countless others who have lost their lives due to police brutality in the US. And let me mention, for our students, given your generation, some of you may not be aware, but Amadou Diallo came from Guinea, and he was shot 41 times for reaching for his wallet to show his identification in New York City. And I think coming from West Africa, much of our student population, not all of our student population, but many of our students, it is important for our West African students and all of our students, Webster worldwide, to know this history and the events that have taken place in the US. Again, we will give all the reverence and respect to those who have lost their lives to police brutality in the US. Now, Webster University, and I'm very, very proud of this, has unequivocally stated that it supports Black lives, and it has shared and reaffirmed its continued commitment towards racial equality and justice for all Black people, and that includes Black students, staff, faculty, etc. And I believe today we're going to have a powerful discussion. It's going to be so engaging. And I'm just proud that we are able to have this important platform today here in Ghana and at the Webster Ghana campus. I believe there's a lot we can do together to end racism and to fight for social justice. And as young people at the Ghana campus, our students, I'm speaking to our students, you have to be proactive and become involved in this fight for justice. So I don't want to take up any more of our time because I know we're here to listen attentively to our speakers. So enjoy the program. Thank you all for taking time to be part of this program today. And most importantly, as Adelina said, happy Juneteenth. There I am.
Thank you very much, Krista. So before we start our lecture, I just want to introduce our esteemed professor, Dr. Njiba Firiwat. She's a research fellow at the Institute of African Studies. She's in the History and Politics section of the Institute, and she received her PhD from Howard University in Washington, D.C., where she focused her research on the role of formal and informal education and Pan-African consciousness in Ghana, that is in 1957 to 1966. Prior to entering the academy, she worked for 15 years in the NGO sector in the US, serving predominantly African or Black people, including community healthcare, civil rights, and employment. Her primary research focuses on Pan-Africanism, African political thought, social movements in global Africa, and the African diaspora. Her current project is titled Outside or Inside, the Contributions of the African Diaspora to Ghanaian Cultural Life, where she focuses on the exchange of cultural features based on the foundation of African identity. She is the primary investigator on the third stream of the Afro-Asian Futures Past project titled Gender and Decoloniality in the Modern African Thought and Societies, Additionally, she has over 26 years of organizing experience in the Pan-African movement, starting as an undergrad student at San Jose State University in the US. Again, I want to welcome Dr. Njiba Firiwat, and we're excited to have your presentation.
Thank you so much. So I hope you can hear me well.
Yeah. Yes, we can.
Fabulous. So I'm going to share my screen. So I'm just letting you all know. I'm just going to share this PowerPoint. Okay, good afternoon and welcome everyone. And first of all, let me just say that I am excited to be on this presentation, but also I really enjoy teaching at Webster. And I enjoy teaching at Webster because students are excited about learning about Africana studies, human rights. They're excited about sort of transforming their ideology. And I'm hoping that today what I'll do is I will bring some interesting information that can make us all think about the way forward. I'm gonna actually put a timer on myself because as people who know know me in my classes, I tend to be a tad bit on the long-winded side. And so if you hear a timer, don't be offended. I just want to go ahead and make sure that I respect the time. And of course, can you imagine you can't even find the timer when you're ready to speak. So what am I going to talk about? The struggle for freedom, connecting the past to the Black Lives Matter movement. So I thought, you know what? In classic Mjiba style, let's talk about what we hope to achieve, but I want us to start to listen to the words of the people on the ground. So today we're going to talk about freedom, what is it, right? We're going to look at a brief history of the civil rights and Black power movements. We're going to look at the Black Lives Matter movement, and then talk a little bit about African liberation and human rights. We're going to look at Black Lives Matter, the origin and potential, and we're going to look at Black Lives Matter in Africa. And then we have a few questions. So let me just be honest, we may not be able to get to all of this, but this is my hope. So I thought, you know what, let's hear from the ground. So this is Tamika Mallory, a Black Lives Matter activist. So let's hear what she has to say about George Floyd and Black Lives Matter.
The reason why buildings are burning is because this city, this state would prefer preserving that white nationalism and that white supremacist mindset over arresting, charging, and helping to convict 4 officers who killed a Black man. That is the reality of what we're dealing with. This is not just a few cops doing things across the country. This is not a good cop versus bad cop situation. This is Ahmaud Arbery being shot down by white men on the streets of Georgia, Breonna Taylor being killed in her home. This is in New York City where we were until freedom. We were just in New York, fighting the police officers who, in the name of social distancing, were damn near killing Black young people on our streets. This is a coordinated activity happening across this nation. And so we are in a state of emergency. Black people are dying in a state of emergency. We cannot look at this as an isolated incident. The reason why buildings are burning are not just for our brother George Floyd. They're burning down because people here in Minnesota are saying to people in New York, to people in California, to people in Memphis, to people all across this nation, enough is enough. And we are not responsible for the mental illness that has been inflicted upon our people by the American government, institutions, and those people who are in positions of power. I don't give a damn if they burn down Target, because Target should be on the streets with us, calling for the justice that our people deserve. Where was AutoZone at the time when Philando Castile was shot in a car, which is what they actually represent? Where were they? So if you are not coming to the people's defense, then don't challenge us when young people and other people who are frustrated and instigated by the people you pay. You are paying instigators to be among our people out there, throwing rocks, breaking windows, and burning down buildings. And so young people are responding to that. They are enraged, and there's an easy way to stop it. Arrest the cops, charge the cops, charge all the cops, not just some of them, not just here in Minneapolis, charge them in every city across America where our people are being murdered. Charge them everywhere. That's the bottom line, charge the cops, do your job. Do what you say. This country is supposed to be about the land of the free for all. It has not been free for Black people, and we are tired. Don't talk to us about looting. Y'all are the looters. America has looted Black people. America looted the Native Americans when they first came here. So looting is what you do. We learned it from you. We learned violence from you. We learned violence from you. The violence was what we learned from you. So if you want us to do better, then damn it, you do better. Reason why Bill.
So that was Tamika Mallory. And she was talking about what this movement means to African Black people today. But she was also talking about the history of America. She was also talking about the transatlantic slave trade. She was also talking about how people are being accused of looting and burning and protesting, but yet and still America is the biggest looter, right? So let's talk a little bit about that. And I want you all to think about this video because we're going to come back to it at the end. So what is freedom? This question of freedom. Black Lives Matter, we're asking for freedom. But what is freedom really? So according to dictionary.com, and I know some of my students are in the room, and I know that they're very clear that dictionary.com is not a scholarly source. So please, next time you come to my class, don't start using dictionary.com as a scholarly source. But freedom, according to dictionary.com, is a power or right to act, speak, or think as one wants without hindrance or restraint. The absence of subjugation to foreign domination. Got foreign domination on the African continent, ladies and gentlemen. The state of not being imprisoned or enslaved. We know about the transatlantic slave trade. The power to determine action without restraint. We know that protesters are absolutely being restrained, both on the continent and off of the continent. Political or national independence. Let's ask ourselves, if we look around the global African world, do we have political or economic or national independence? And this question about personal liberty as opposed to bondage and slavery. It's Juneteenth, the day in which enslaved Africans found that they were free. But the question we want to ask ourselves, if you're physically free from slavery, are you really free? So I want to show a picture of some of my students that from the Africana Studies class, and I see a couple of them on the program here, and we were at the Elmina slave dungeon. And so behind us, you see the wind, blazing, blowing, you see nice palm trees, you can see the sea, and it seems like such an amazing afternoon, an amazing outing. But this was after we had toured the slave dungeon, where African men and women were enslaved and kept for over 3 months, where they had to be marched from the interior of the African continent to the coast, where they were then shipped on boats to taken across a 3-month middle passage, where many died, where women were raped, where people were thrown overboard, where enslaved masters on the captors on the ship, where they forced enslaved Africans to eat the flesh of their colleagues who were rebelling against slavery. This is the legacy that Black Lives Matter is standing on. They're standing on the legacy of Nat Turner, who led one of the most successful slave rebellions in the US. Black Lives Matter is standing on the legacy of enslaved Africans who in the Elmina Castle, if they were rebelling and fighting against slavery, they were put into a specific cell with the X over it, and they were basically put in that cell to die. And some of my students who are on this call can tell you about the emotion of seeing this slave dungeon, of seeing our descendants. So when we think about, is Black Lives Matter connected to Africa? Let's remind ourselves that just a year and a half ago, many Webster students found ourselves at the Elmina Castle, and we saw where our ancestors, only 4 generations really ago, where they took their last breath of African air, what they saw the last time they got on that boat in order to be taken to the Americas. So when we think about Black Lives Matter, we can't just start today. We have to go back to the conditions in which African people found themselves during slavery in the United States. And I want to draw our attention to the left side of the screen. And it says a great sale of slaves. So this is exciting, right? January 10th, 1855. So this is close to over 200 years after the first enslaved African was recorded to land in Jamestown. They're selling $3, age 20 to 26, strong and able-bodied. One wench, Sally, age 42, excellent, and she can cook well. One wench, and I believe the name is Lizzie, age 23, with a 6-month-old, pickaninny. $1, age 42, good, a kennel man, a 52, I'm sorry, and $17, age 12 to 20, in excellent condition. This is the sale of human beings. This is not the sale of chickens. This is not the sale of cattle. This is not the sale of Ghana must go bags. This is the sale of human beings in 1855. And in 2020, we're still saying Black Lives Matter. Let's look at these pictures on our right. What was slavery like in America? We see this man who clearly has been whipped continuously. And I suspect he was whipped because he was fighting against slavery. He was rebelling against enslavement. And we see a group of children and women picking cotton. This is around the 1800s in America. So let's ask ourselves, are we enslaved still? And this is only 10 years before we start celebrating Juneteenth. So I want to do a quick, brief history of the Civil Rights Movement and Black Power movement. And I'm just doing this because I think it's important for us to talk about where we came from and where we went. 1619, the first enslaved African arrives in Jamestown. So that means that for plenty of years, they were marching people from the coast. They kept them in the Cape Coast and Elmina Castles and the Goree Island up in Senegal. They put them on ships. They had them for 3 months, and then they arrived in Jamestown. By 1865, slavery is abolished. We see this is over 200 years. But that didn't mean that African people were free in the US. 1948, that was the first time that segregation was ended in the armed forces. 1954, there is this legislation called Brown versus Board of Education, where basically it meant that segregation was eliminated in the school system. But we know that that is not the case. We know that there was a Little Rock Nine. We know that there were people who still had to desegregate schools, and they were treated horribly. This is 1954, ladies and gentlemen. And then 1955, 1 year and a few months after Brown versus Board of Education, Emmett Till, a 14-year-old from Chicago, is brutally murdered in Mississippi for allegedly whistling at a white woman. So this is a picture of Emmett Till on our left-hand side of the screen. Perhaps you're right. A young 14-year-old, 1955. He was from Chicago. He was enjoying life. He went down to the South to Mississippi to visit family. He mistakenly whistled at a white woman, or allegedly whistled at a white woman. The white woman's husband and several of other white colleagues went to the boy's house, took him out the house, hung him, and threw him in the river. Let's look at this. The nation is shocked in the lynching of a Chicago youth. His body was so disfigured that his mother had an open casket so people could see the horrors of lynching. I'll let you all Google Emmett Till's funeral. Then, from 1955 to 1963, we had a series of civil rights actions that culminated August 28, 1963, with 250,000 people marching on Washington for jobs and freedom. Now let's remember this from the beginning. What did Tamika say? We want freedom. What is freedom? So in 1865, African people in the US were supposed to be free. In 1963, there's 250 people marching on Washington for jobs and freedom. But I thought in 1865, we were granted freedom. Turns out we weren't. Martin Luther King gives his famous I Have a Dream speech. And as the closing address in front of the Lincoln Memorial, he says, I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out to the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. So I'm asking us, are we really equal? Tamika Mallory said we're not. Black Lives Matter organizers says we're not equal. So how is it that in 1963, Martin Luther King called for equality, the very same equality that we should have gotten in 1865? Even if we don't talk about the lack of humanity and the human rights violations of the transatlantic slave trade. Now, from Martin Luther King, there was another amazing activist, and his name was Malcolm X. And I think it's important for us to hear from Malcolm X, because Malcolm X was in something called the Nation of Islam, and you can look up the Nation of Islam. But Malcolm X was Muslim, and he took his Hajj to Mecca, and he came to Ghana, this very Ghana that we're in, and he met with Kwame Nkrumah. And when he met with Kwame Nkrumah, and he also talked to Kwame Ture and other people that were in Ghana at that time, including Maya Angelou, he began to change the way in which he viewed race and class in America. And he went back to America, and he had a different view about his relationship to US imperialism and white supremacy and the world and internationalism. And Malcolm X became an internationalist. So when we ask ourselves, what does this have to do with us? We also have to ask ourselves, have people come before us that drew the connections between Black Lives Matter in America and what's happening on the African continent? In the great spirit, I'm going to let us hear from Malcolm X, because while I'm just bringing this information, there are many that have come before me that had quality critical information.
A lot of people are confused by the Arabic name, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz. This is always, I've always had the name on my passport, Malik El-Shabazz. I only used it in the Muslim world. Well, Hajj is the title that's given to any Muslim who makes the pilgrimage to Mecca during the official Hajj season. Well, you now use Shabazz and drop X. I'll probably continue to use Malcolm X because, and I'll probably use it as long as the situation that produced it exists. You don't feel that Shabazz takes the place of it. My going to Mecca and going into the Muslim world, into the African world, and being recognized and accepted as a Muslim and as a brother may solve the problem for me personally. But I personally feel that my personal problem is never solved as long as the problem is not solved for all of our people in this country. So I remain Malcolm X as long as there's a need to protest and struggle and fight against the injustices that our people are involved in this country.
Are you prepared to go into the United Nations at this point and ask that charges be brought against the United States for its treatment of American Negroes?
Oh, yeah. Please. I think it's right in my book. The audience have be quiet.
Sorry about that. I hope you can hear the video now.
As I pointed out when I was during my trip, that nations.
Yes, we can.
Great. Thank you, Krista.
Latin American nations look very hypocritical when they stand up in the United Nations condemning the racist practices of South Africa and that which is practiced by Portugal and Angola, and saying nothing in the UN about the racist practices that are manifest every day against Negroes in this society. Even in South Africa, those Africans aren't faced with bayonets and aren't faced with police dogs. I would be not a man If I was in a position to bring it in front of the United Nations and didn't do so, I wouldn't be a man.
Malcolm, do you intend to lead the charge in the United Nations?
Well, I find that to say you're going to lead something creates a lot of hostility, division, jealousy, and envy. I hope to work with any group of leaders or any.
No.
So my time is a little short, so I'm not going to show the whole video, but I suggest you go to YouTube and find Malcolm X's video, and I can send it to you all where he comes back from Mecca. And there's another amazing video on Malcolm X, Message to the Grassroots. It's about 40 minutes, but it's very dynamic, and it really speaks to some of the challenges that we're facing. So this was 1963, in which Malcolm X gave this interesting interview where he talked about internationalism. He talked about how African countries must come to the United Nations and fight on behalf of what's happening to African people in the US. Within 2 years, he was killed in New York, 1965. Again, you can certainly go and look online and find out more about the death of Malcolm X. And interestingly enough, there's this woman here, Grace, and I'm forgetting her last name, but she's Japanese, and she was part and parcel of the Black Power movement in the US. So this tells you that this is not just about race, it's about human rights. It's about what's correct and what's not correct. And then just 3 years later, Martin Luther King is killed in 1968. So the same Martin Luther King who was talking about the March on Washington and talking about equality and freedom was killed 3 years after Malcolm X. Interestingly enough, he was killed 3 years after he started talking about internationalism. After he did his Vietnam speech where he said that we should not be in Vietnam because the Vietnamese people are not killing African people, right? And then he was killed. So there seems to be a trend. And I know I have about 9 minutes, so I'm gonna quickly push through. So I also want us to look at the Black Panther Party. And the reason why I think it's important that we look at the Black Panther Party that was started in 1966 in Oakland, California, where I was born and raised, by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale and many other Africans. They said that there's a 10-point plan. The Black Panther Party was started because of mass amounts of police violence and police brutality in Oakland, California. And it spread across the entire US. But I want to highlight something. First off, we see the Black Panther Party intercommunal news service, right? And we see that there are African women on this newspaper on the front page. So let's talk about let's talk about the role of Black women in the liberation struggle. This is something also that's particularly important. So the Black Panther Party, what do they want? And I'm reading this specifically because I'm going to bring this to Black Lives Matter. They want freedom. We talked about freedom to begin with. Freedom is lack of bondage. Freedom is being able to, as Kwame Nkrumah says, manage your own affairs. So 1865, we wanted freedom. 1963, we wanted freedom. 1966, we want freedom. Malika Mallory said, we want freedom. What's happening here? We want full employment for our people. We want an end to the robbery by the capitalists of our Black and brown oppressed communities. We want decent housing. We want education. We want all Black men and women to be exempt from military service. We want an immediate end to police brutality. We want freedom for all Black men held in federal, state, and county prisons. We want all Black people, when brought to trial, to be tried in court by a jury of their peers. And we want land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, and peace. For those who have taken my human rights courses, these sound an awful lot like the Declaration of Human Rights. Am I right? That was established in 1948. So in 1966, African Black people in the US are demanding human rights, the same human rights that they have been denied. So now let's move to the Black Lives Matter. And also you can read the autobiography of Malcolm X if you have not read it. So that's an important point that we also have. And I think we have that in the library, if I'm not mistaken, Krista. So the question that we have to ask, we have it in the library?
We have it, and we have actually a list that Dr. Williams and myself, I've recently added some books that our students can read. And we've also shared it with all the other international campuses, and that was just done yesterday. So we will make sure to send a list of books that we recommend. And we'd love for you to also add in, Mjiba, on what you think our students should be reading around all that you have shared.
Absolutely, absolutely, definitely. So now we're going to turn our attention to Black Lives Matter, because unfortunately I only have 5 minutes. How 30 minutes go so quickly, I truly don't understand. But so what is Black Lives Matter? It's a movement of millions of people who are concerned about the oppression and repression of Black African people in America and worldwide. It's ordinary Black and brown people who pulled together to protest police violence against unarmed communities. So we're talking 1990s, 2000, 2013, 2015. You have people in the streets protesting against the extrajudicial killings of Black and brown people by the hands of the police. We're talking about murder. It officially started in 2013, but it has a long history before the official launch. And this is the Black Lives Matter logo off their website. So I want to, sorry about that. I don't know what's happening. Aha, there we go. I want to explain what they do. And this is taken directly off their website. Black Lives Matter, we're expansive. We're a collective of liberators who believe in inclusive and spacious movement. So ultimately, this is a movement that includes everyone, right? It includes Black and brown people. It includes men and women. It includes people in the LGBTQI community, trans women, trans men. Everyone who's being oppressed, Black Lives Matter incorporates. And it's because it doesn't matter your gender, your sexual orientation, or your class. If you're Black or brown in spaces like in racialized spaces like in America or South Africa or Brazil or Colombia, you can be a target for this type of brutality. They affirm the lives of Black, queer, and trans folk, disabled folks, undocumented folks, basically everyone who's often left out of the conversation. And we're working for a world where Black lives are no longer systematically targeted for demise. And we have to be clear about this. Tamika Mallory said, this is not just a few bad people, a few bad apples. There's a system which started with the transatlantic slave trade, culminated with colonialism and segregation and Jim Crow. Then we had the fight for liberation, civil rights, and the fight for Black power. And now we're looking at the fight for Black Lives Matter. And Pan-Africanism. We affirm our humanity, our contributions to the society, and or resilience in the face of deadly oppression. And we can let this be shared, the PowerPoint. So I just want to say, I want to show this picture because I was at this march. And this is National Black United Front, an organization that was started in the 1990s. They're out marching in Washington, D.C. You see Black power at the bottom. You see Black people united. You see red, black, and green flags, right? Marcus Garvey's flag. Marcus Garvey, who said Africa for African, the UNIA. African people in America are simply the cousins of African people on the continent. So the moment that we say that Black Lives Matter or Black people in America don't have anything to do with me, the African, that's like saying if your cousin dies, you won't go to their funeral. That's like saying if your cousin gets married, you won't go to the wedding. That's like saying that you see your cousin on campus and you don't speak to them because they're just your cousin. Ultimately, everything that happens to Black African people in America, Brazil, Colombia should be of major importance to African people in Nigeria, in Cameroon, in Benin, in Ghana. Now, I also want to I know I have 2 minutes, so don't worry, I'm almost finished. I also want to talk a little bit about Black Lives 2020. And I want to share that there's a Say Her Name campaign. Because Black Lives Matter is oftentimes quoted around, or we're also focused on the killing of Mike Brown, George Floyd, Eric Gardner, all men, all valuable. Trayvon Martin, these are all things that we need to focus on. But what we often don't focus on is the women who are killed by police or in police custody. So Sandra Bland died in police custody. She was in a jail cell and died. And they said that it was a suicide. Natasha McKinney was tasered to death in jail. Can you imagine being arrested and you're tasered to death in jail? Michelle Clouseau was shot and killed a few days after Michael Brown was shot and killed and left in the street. Dominique Fells and Rhea Milton murdered in Cincinnati, 2 trans women. We don't hear much about them. And Breonna Taylor, most recently in Louisville, Kentucky, shot in her bed when there was a no-knock warrant on her apartment. The police had the wrong apartment. They knocked, they came in, the boyfriend thought there was an intruder, had a legal weapon, shot at the police. The police fired so many bullets into the home that it killed Breonna Taylor in her bed. This is why we're saying Black Lives Matter. Now, what can you do? You can join an organization fighting for the liberation and unification of Africa and African people globally. And why can you do that? You can do that because if Africa is not liberated and free and Pan-Africanism is not a fruition, it does not come to fruition, African people will be killed in Brazil and Colombia and Venezuela and the Americas. Educate our, you see, there it is. I'm almost done, I swear. Educate our youth about Pan-Africanism and show how it will benefit them and their descendants. When organizing protests and rebellions against murder in our communities, do it from a Pan-African perspective. There was actually a rally at Black Star Square, I think it was June 4th. And there were plenty of people that came out. And actually the leader, can you imagine that the leader got arrested for protesting against police brutality by the police? I can't even imagine that. And most importantly, recognize the limitations of the world in which we live in. This means until we seriously talk about alternatives to capitalism, we will be mourning another African month after month. So now I want to say this. I'm not quite done. I have 2 minutes left. Please, I'm begging our moderator. Let's discuss. We are in Africa. Why must I care? This is what I want us to discuss during the discussion. So I want to say that there's no introductions to the last video that I'm going to show. I won't show the whole thing because I know I'm a bit behind, but I just want us to think about this. Even if Beyonce and Kendrick Lamar recognize that there's a serious contradiction, I'm thinking we all should. Are we ready?
So we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice.
Can you hear it now? Okay, I don't think you can hear the video, so that's okay. Go to Beyonce and Kendrick Lamar BET Awards and you'll be able to hear it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Friawat.
And let me stop sharing. Hold
Thanks so
on,
much.
hold on. How do I stop sharing? Wait a minute. Aha, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fairwhite, for that very thought-provoking presentation. I'm sure a lot of us have a lot of questions, but I would ask that we write down our questions or keep them written down somewhere until the end, and we'll have our Q&A. So we're going to move on now to our next presentation, and that's going to be done by our Chief Diversity Officer, Vincent Llewellyn. And before that, I just want to introduce Vincent. Vincent joined Webster University in October 2018. He provides key leadership for the university's core value of advancing diversity and inclusion as part of the educational mission through the university's network of domestic and international locations. With almost 2 decades of experience weaving diversity, inclusion, and equity into the culture of education in the St. Louis area, Llewellyn mostly most recently served as a Director of Equity and Inclusion at the College School in Webster Groves. Before taking his role at the College School, he taught in the Ladue School District and for Mary Institute and St. Louis Country Day School. He also served as a center director for the University City's Children's Center. Additionally, Llewellyn has served as an adjunct professor at the Brown School of Social Work at Washington University in St. Louis for the past 6 years. And he served as a consultant to Washington University in St. Louis in 2006 and 2007. For the past 16 years, he has served as a consultant on diversity and inclusion issues for a variety of schools organizations, including the Kirkwood School District, the John Burroughs School, the Forsyth School, the Cochrane Community Center, and Focus St. Louis. Llewellyn has also served as a director for development for St. Louis nonprofit neighborhood houses, now known as Unleashing Potential. Llewellyn served as a managing director of programs for Teach for America, St. Louis, and he was a Speakers Bureau coordinator for the Missouri Coalition for Life-Saving Cures. Llewellyn holds a Master of Social Work from Brown School of Social Work at Washington University in St. Louis, and his BA in Education is from Maryville University. Welcome to this discussion, Vincent Llewellyn, and we're really excited to hear what you have for us today. Let me quickly pull up your presentation.
Thank you very much for having me. That was a fantastic presentation, a hard act to follow. And you can truthfully go ahead and take that down. Thank you. I'd like to be able to see some faces if I may. Oh, yeah, I forgot about that. So, okay, I'm gonna move quickly as well. These photos here are from a protest here in St. Louis in which I participated on June, I think this was June 1st here in St. Louis. And so this is the start of that protest. And as we just heard, so many people have been called to act in ways differently by joining these protests that they previously just had not. And so this is in our downtown area. That's fine, go ahead and advance. Downtown area, right outside, to your right there, you see our city hall to the right, and then to the left are our courts buildings. And so there were about 2,500 people who gathered this afternoon. It was a Monday afternoon to protest. We heard about how many of these voices, particularly around the Black Lives Matter, are folks who represent a broad swath of our society. Women, men, lesbians, gays are all actively involved. But what's really interesting, and I participated in protests back in 2014 when Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson. I believe many of you all may know about Ferguson, and if not, I encourage you all to Google Mike Brown and the Ferguson uprisings. But at that point, there were a good number of white folks, but now these protests involve so many white folks, so many white folks. Go ahead and continue. Can you imagine protesting with thousands of people in the middle of a pandemic, right? So we still are trying to do the masks and not so much the social distancing. I really position myself at that front of the line in front of the thousands of people. At one point I stepped aside just so I could get kind of the photos of the crowd going by, but I'm pretty serious about this pandemic and the social distancing stuff. So despite the thousands of folks present, I found myself at the very front. Go ahead. We marched from City Hall to the St. Louis Arch that you see there in the background. That right there on the left is the arch, but then to the right, this is what's really interesting about today in particular. That building is what we call the old courthouse. And from those steps would be some of those great cells of those bucks of Black folks on those steps. Particularly in this building here was a court session called the Dred Scott cases. Dred and his wife Harriet Scott were slaves here in St. Louis, in Missouri, and they sued for their freedom. And that suit took place in that very building right there. And so on the steps of that building are statues that honor both Dred and Harriet Scott. From there, we marched to the St. Louis Arch, which is really the symbol of St. Louis, and took a knee for 8 minutes and 46 seconds to honor George Floyd. Posted on each of the legs of the arch were demands and wishes of folks. And so people, one by one, went and placed Post-its. Go ahead. Go ahead, we'll just kind of flip through these. From the arch, we walked onto a highway, and we actually shut down Highway 40 for about an hour, just to kind of send a message and to grab more attention of folks who, at rush hour traffic were slightly inconvenienced for about an hour of having to sit in both directions as we occupied the highway. Yep. On the left, I thought this is really interesting. On the left, we have in Washington, D.C., the Mayor Bowser has renamed this street Black Lives Matter Plaza, and Black Lives Matter Plaza actually leads as a road directly to the White House. And so it was a very powerful statement and image there. On the right, you see Webster University stands for racial equity and justice, Black Lives Matter. We, as the university, we installed this sign, this banner. What's really interesting about it is that it had been up for about a week, and then someone stole it in the course of the night. And within hours that morning, we had it back up. But not only did we have one back up, we actually had two placed back on the campus. So you took down one and we put up two. And so there are two signs like that on the Webster University campus, and very highly visible spaces. The university and its declaration of Black Lives Matter is really a further commitment of the work that the university has done over the years, right? We have over 100, as an institution, we're 100 years old, and we were founded with the intent of really serving those who have been marginalized and left out. And we started as an institution educating women. Now, let's be clear also that within the context of history, as we just heard, America has not always gotten it right. And truthfully, Webster University has not always gotten it right in that regard, just based on the context of history, right? However, Webster has always been on the forefront. And so the fact that in 1915, we opened as an institution to educate women. That was 4 years before women in the United States had the right to vote. Think about that. 4 years before women had the right to vote, an institution was educated with the purpose of educating those women. We, in 1950, enrolled our first two African-American women 4 years before the Brown versus Board of Education, which required that schools integrate. We were 4 years before that, right? And so the university has been very progressive in that regard and continues to be. We are not only making the declarations in our communications to our community of students, faculty, staff, and alum worldwide of our Black Lives Matter, but we've also then taken this bold statement there. If you advance one more, I think this one will feature an ad that we have also, that is, as of yesterday, running in our Black weekly newspaper. Again, just affirming our commitment to this work. It is one thing to say that you value and that Black Lives Matter. It's another thing to actually show up and to do that. And I'm honored and pleased to work with an administrative team that is committed to doing that work now more than ever. We're having some very hard conversations at our campus. We are listening, or across our network for that matter. We will be listening to the voices of our Black students, our alum, our faculty and staff, and what I'm calling just town hall listening sessions with the purpose of just listening, right? They're going to be in small groups so that everyone can actually speak. I just said town hall, but that's just kind of a model. But town halls, I don't want it to be that large of a space because it's just too hard to hear everyone. We want to focus in and to really hear those experiences. We recognize and realize that the lived experiences of African American and Black Americans on our campus will and is very different than the lived experiences of our white colleagues. And so we want to hear those stories, and we want to be able to respond and to meet the needs that are expressed. And so I say to you all in Ghana that and I said this when I was on the campus, it's so unique for you all because racism, what is racism, right? You all are among a population of folks that wherever you turn, from the president all the way down to the person who's cleaning the street with the broom every morning, right? They all look like you. And that's powerful. We unfortunately don't have that experience here as Black Americans. I am, one of, and Krista will tell you this, I'm one of a limited number of Black folks in administrative roles at the university. We do a great job as a team of hearing those voices, but there's much work for us to yet do. Here in the country, Barack Obama was our first Black president, right? And truth be told, maybe our last one for a while. There's talk that Biden will look for an African-American woman to join his ticket as vice president, right? That'll be monumental and historical for us as well, should that happen. But we don't have those experiences. And so I think about, should any of you all come to America, and I encourage you all to visit us at the home campus in Webster Groves, your experiences will immediately change. And I hate to say that, but it's the bit of the reality, right? You all will go from, where you can walk around Ghana Pride or AU Proud on the continent there to come here, whereby the experience will be different. And we will be here to help support that for you. But I want you all to know that the experiences that you all have are really true gifts that you all are able to look throughout your entire existence. That was one of the most powerful things for us when we came this past October, right? Our students continued to talk about how impactful that was to see a billboard, and I talk about this, a billboard for, it was pasta sauce. I saw a billboard for pasta sauce with Black people. We don't have billboards with pasta sauce with Black folks here in America, right? Now, it'll be interesting to see how all of this will change, because now, not only has Webster University taken today off, right, here in the United States, and Krista has extended that to her staff there, but Nike, Google, Target, major corporations here in the United States, Twitter, right? I'm trying to think of some that you all will know. Facebook, they have also taken today as a day to reflect and to honor the history of Black Americans and this freedom piece. Now, what I actually find interesting is that we are still fighting for our freedom. Let us be 100% clear on that. We are still fighting for our freedom. Still fighting for our freedom. And in partnership with our global network, I'm proud to also say that I just learned that, that list that you said you just shared, Krista, across our international campuses, there are other conversations taking place today also across our international campuses about this very topic here. And so there is a university commitment to furthering this conversation and moving into conversations that in fact can be uncomfortable. And I think you all can understand why it can be uncomfortable and challenging and hard. Is because it calls white folks to have to listen to stories that may be filled with a lot of pain and hurt that are contrary to their own lived experiences, filled often with joy and great fondness, right? And that's a hard space to be in. It's a hard space to be in, to realize that your lived experiences may not be the same as someone else's. And so we are honored and proud and pleased with the work that's being done over at the Webster Ghana campus. This lecture here, I think, is fantastic. It's a great opportunity, and I know that you all will be having a public lecture as well to continue the conversation and the dialogue. And I thank you all for the opportunity to be included and to be a part of this. Thank you very much. Thank you. Happy Juneteenth.
Happy Juneteenth. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Vincent, for this very important discussion. We're going to move on now to our question and answers, and this will be facilitated by our academic director, Dr. Michael Williams. So as shared before, if you would like to ask a question, you can either raise up your hand or you can write in the chats your question, and then we'll read it out for you guys, for everyone. Do we have any questions at this point? Does anyone want to raise up their hand for a question or write it in the chats?
Great. Should I
Yes,
begin with?
Yes, you can.
Okay, I want to thank Vincent, my lookalike twin. Some of you all may remember how closely we resemble each other. It's a pleasure to hear him give such a wonderful talk. So a great talk, Vincent, and also Njiba.
Thank you.
Before I just want to maybe ask a couple questions and then kind of turn the floor over to everyone else. But before I do, I want to maybe announce or to advise or recommend or suggest that students who have an interest in this subject or some of these issues that are raised should consider some of our courses in Africana Studies, where you have an opportunity to go into more depth. Certainly, if Dr. Fawad has more time, she can really provide more detail. And in fact, there's one course, she'll be teaching two courses in the fall, one Introduction to Human Rights, but also Introduction to Africana Studies. So we want to encourage you all to do that. So, you know, I have a bunch of questions, but again, I think it's more important that we hear from the students. And so let me just bounce a couple questions off of Vincent and Njiba, and then maybe we can open up, and then maybe I could ask some more later. Vincent, you talked about the discussion. We need to have more discussion in town meetings, and which is great. I'm just wondering, do you have any goals in mind? Is there anything you would like to see done structurally at Webster St. Louis or Webster globally that you think would enhance this struggle to get everyone to see that Black Lives Matter? Is there anything that you think that would help to sustain it? Any structural changes that we may haven't considered? So that's one for Vincent. And for Njiba, one of the things, I could be wrong, but it seems like there are more women who are involved on the front lines with the Black Lives Movement, as far as voicing their aspirations and all. I know women were intricately involved in the movement, the civil rights movement, Black Power movement, all movements, but their voices were often marginalized, I think, or I could be wrong, during that time. Whereas today, I see, like the video you showed, I see women, just everyone. I think one of the founders probably of the Black Lives Movement is also a woman. So I'm just wondering, is there any difference in the contribution, not contributions, but in the personification of the movement today along gender lines? So I'll leave you with those two questions, and then maybe we can open it up, or I can ask more. Thank you.
I'm a gentleman, so I will yield to Dr. Friawa first, and then I'll follow up after her.
Okay. Let me make sure my mic is on. Thank you very much. So I think, Dr. Williams, I think that this is an amazing question. I think it's a very astute observation, right? Because what I've noticed is that between civil rights, Black Power, even the African nationalist struggles on the continent, and Black Lives Matter, women have always played a very major role in these victories, right? Always. You can't tell me in the history of African people's struggle that women were not at the front lines. What has happened though, prior to these recent protests and movements, women have oftentimes been marginalized. And also what I've noticed is that the history of women's contributions have been marginalized. And that's also about who writes history, right? What is that proverb? Until the lion, learns to speak, the hunter will always be victorious, right? And so women have been at the forefront, because I'm thinking about Fannie Lou Hamer, I'm thinking about Rosa Parks, I'm thinking about Miriam Makeba, I'm thinking about Yaa Asantewaa. All of these women have, and the women of Eritrea, for example, who are on the front lines, guns in their hands and babies on their back. But when the history comes out, oftentimes men are elevated. And this is a product of patriarchy, right? Which is an offshoot of capitalism, right? Where it says that, patriarchy is ultimately a system in which men make rules and regulations for society, and gender is socially constructed. And this also happens in movements, right? But what you find in the Black Lives Matter movement is that women are coming straight towards patriarchy and saying, we will not, accept patriarchal behavior inside this movement. However, I also would like to say that prior to this, Angela Davis, Assata Shakur, all of these women in these movements also came straight for patriarchy. I think the difference is technology. And the reason why I say this, because when I'm thinking about when we were marching in 92, and I know I'm giving my age, I know I look like I'm 21, but when we were marching, I see some of my students laughing, it's not funny. When we were marching in 1992 for Rodney King, there were women on the front lines. I myself, when the Million Man March happened in 1995, we had a silent march at San Jose State. I was 21 and I was one of the main speakers. But the difference is now there's instant communication. So those women are instantly being streamed on Facebook. So nobody can write history. No one can write women out of the history of the Black Lives Matter movement as they've been written out of other historical moments. And I think this is really the difference, because women have been on the front lines. It's just who's telling the history. And it hasn't necessarily been African women. That's my point.
Great, appreciate it. Thank you.
And then what I think I would say to my question is, we are looking to have, benchmarks, right? And so I would love for us to get to a space and place where we are able to measure our progress around this work. I want to be really clear and careful though, in terms of it's not a matter of quota, right? When we talk about expanding our faculty and to include faculty of color, we have to also get to a space where we can do some work. And I'm partnering, just yesterday I had a conversation with HR, our Human Resources Office, in terms of what does it mean to have training to help faculty? Because, both doctors here on this call here, Dr. Williams and Dr. Friawa, you all know that faculty are the ones who hire faculty. It's not me in my role. I don't hire faculty. The chancellor does not hire faculty. Faculty hire faculty. And when a position becomes available, that is the faculty who then are responsible for that hire. And so we know that often what happens is that we reach out to our networks. We reach out to people who look like us and we say, hey, there's an opening here. Why don't you apply? And those are your buddies. Those are your friends, right? Those are your professional colleagues. And you get into this mindset of hiring folks who look like you because they are part of your network and your circle. Well, we need to break that cycle. And we need to break the cycle in terms of what does it mean to deal with your implicit bias and how to settle and table that, right? And so we need to have conversations from an HR standpoint with members of our faculty team, with members of our deans across our campuses. You know, what does that mean to not close out a search committee or a faculty search until you have representation that you're looking to have, right? And it's not a matter of, well, the time is ticking and in school, we need to make this call right now. No, maybe you need to continue your search right now, right? And you need to find new networks. And so it's big level stuff that will take some time, right? Because you have to change systems. That's why we call this systemic racism or institutional racism or whatever, because we're talking years, hundreds of years of operating like this. You know, they talk about computers back in the day. You put bad garbage in, you're gonna get bad garbage out, right? And so it's this whole idea that our systems need to change, right? And so it's easier, I will be honest, to say for me in my role to really be able to kind of influence where I can and where I can have the greatest impact right now and with some quick measurable outcomes and successes, the work around students and student relationships. So partnering with our director of undergraduate admissions who fully understands this, right? We had a conversation when she came on board. We offer in St. Louis, we had previously offered 2 partial scholarships for African Americans named after Dr. Donald Suggs here in St. Louis, an African American Black dentist here. And we increased this year for this upcoming school year from 2 partials to 10 full ride scholarships, right? And those are institutional dollars, right? Those are not, you know, obviously I would love to go out and find some donors to help so that we can then take it to 20, right? But at the same time, it's these incremental steps, right? And so we look at our retention programs, we look at our ways and how are we supporting our students of color. Right before COVID, we brought on, because where we are located, there are no Black barbers, right? And so, you know, Krista and Adeline and Abby will tell you, while I was there, I was, you know, trying to find a Black barbershop in Ghana, right? I went to the 2 barbershops in my, 2 weeks there or whatever it was. And so it's important to us. And I brought onto our campus, found a space. So my Black barber has a barber chair in the basement of Webster Hall. And twice a month on Sundays, he comes and he does his service for students on campus. There's a program that I launched called RISE, Resilience Inspires Student Excellence. And it's for African-American males who academically we saw were kind of struggling, right? And so it was an additional support system. We get together on Sunday, we have a Sunday night soul food dinner, I bring in a mentor, but those students, those men, I take care of their haircuts for them, right? So that they can, we know the importance of how we feel, we get a haircut, we feel better, we feel more confident, we feel, and so it's a bunch of small initiatives to answer your question that will take probably about 5 or so years for us to really see some real impact there.
Appreciate it, Vincent. That's great. That's great to hear.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have a question in the chat. I would read that out, and that's from Francis. Francis is asking that throughout history, men and women of color have lived, fought, and probably died for freedom, liberty, and equality. And now we are facing racial injustice, so it's still continuing. How can we truly break the cycle of racism if there are people out there with superiority complex who won't listen? Yes, I don't know who, I'll do it out to PG because she was very excited about the question, so please.
I was, thank you so much. first off, I think this is an amazing question, Francis. I see you paid attention in Africana Studies. I think that this is a critical question, right? If you look at the presentation that I did, I mean, we're talking 1619 to now, we're having similar problems, similar challenges, similar types of oppression. You look across the African continent, and I use this as an example every time, you know, we're using, all of our machines are using coltan, right? Coltan that comes out of the Congo, where 1 in 4 women in their lifetime will be raped in the Congo that's in civil war. And over 1 million people have lost their lives. Let's look at Rwanda, 1994. Over 1 million people lost their lives. So we have to ask ourselves, what is happening, right? And so what we have to recognize is, one, as Malcolm X said, in one of his, he didn't say it in this video, but in one video, Malcolm X says, we have to go to the root of the problem. Malcolm X says, we got to go to the root of the tree, right? Because the tree won't grow unless you have good roots, right? And so, in my opinion, the root is capitalism and globalization. And this, through capitalism, what you find is people become commodified as property and profit. And so every material, human or non-human, in the African world is commodified. And it's commodified in order to make these global capitalists and corporations rich. And so what do we need? Let's ask ourselves this. We need Pan-Africanism, the liberation and unification of Africa. We need African countries to come together to begin to fight for African people. And let me give you an example of what we're dealing with right now in Ghana. COVID-19. What if there was a unified, fully African response to COVID-19? Where would we be? Where would we? Would we have close to 13,000 cases in Ghana? Would people have been dying? Would we have hundreds of people dying in South Africa as we speak? That's just a simple case. And let's also, I'm going to give a quick example and then I'll move on, and I'll let Vincent you know, come on to this discussion. If we think about the deaths of African people at the hands of the police in the US, in Brazil, in England, we need to ask ourselves, how many Chinese people have we seen killed by the police in the US? How many Chinese people are killed in Brazil? What happens here in Ghana when the military came after the Chinese? I mean, the press came after the Chinese that were doing Galamsey. What happened? The Chinese ambassador came out and said, you all must get off of our Chinese people, because China fights for her people around the world, because China has some sense of sovereignty. So the question becomes, Africa as a continent, if in fact we were unified and had sovereignty, we could fight and resolve all of these issues. This is a long-term goal, of course. It's not going to happen overnight, but I think we need to have long-term goals and then have small steps to get to those long-term goals. Sorry for the long response.
I would just add to that it's so interesting. You know, I think about the fact that, you know, we were there as a part of the year of the return, right? And you think about the large number of African Americans who returned to Ghana, you know, during 2019 to participate in the year of the return, right? And you think about the economic impact that had on that country, right? I would also love to hear Ghanaians and the Ghanaian government also speak out and against what is happening here in America to Black folks too, right? And it's also, how do we unite? You raise a good point, right? Like, there's the Continental, the AU needing to unite together, right? But there's also the need for us to do that across our globe also as Black people, or as people who are from, right? And so being able to support that. But I also think that it's really important for us to think in terms of how do we, I mean, we are where we are. You know, this is one of those, I hate to say this, but, you know, it's a mix. Like, you talk about just death in vain, right? George Floyd's death is not in vain because of the way in which we all, with our own eyes, saw that murder, the way in which he was killed, right? And the way in which those officers stood either in silence for the one or the other three who joined in putting their weight of their bodies on top of his body, right? I don't know if you all have seen yet, what's happening in Atlanta at the Wendy's store also, right? We are seeing and capturing all this stuff on video. Can you also imagine what's happening in the dark of night when there is no video, right? If the police can be so bold as to push a 75-year-old white man to the ground during daylight and walk away, this is a white man, right? If they could do that, can you only imagine what they'll do to a black man in the dark of night? Right? Mm-hmm. And so these stories are happening. That's what the outrage is also about. We're talking about, people say, oh, they shouldn't lose. Oh, they shouldn't. You can't tell me how to grieve. You can't tell me how my pain, how if you were to lose someone in your life, I wouldn't tell you how to grieve the loss of a mother, a child, because that's not my grief. That's not my journey, right? And I think about the fact that when we see people becoming physical and violent out on the streets, we don't know if that's outrage in a way of, because it happened to their brother, to their father, to their boyfriend, to their lover, to their best friend, to their cousin, to their nephew, and it didn't make it onto the news. It didn't make it onto the news. And so there's so much of that anger that we have to also be willing to also own and be willing to say as a society, not we Black folks, but we as Americans, to say, we haven't done this right. And we need to really have some truth and reconciliation conversations like South Africa had. And that this is America's original stain, and we still have not yet addressed it.
Thanks so much for that contribution, Njiba and Vincent. We have another question, and this is from Abraham. It says, he says, how do we make the change sustainable? In the sense that we always have to wait till someone dies for us to start protesting and pushing for change. And also, how do we make the change that can happen even from the African perspective? So again, whoever wants to go first, please feel free.
Vincent, do you want to go or do you want me to take it?
You go ahead.
Okay. So again, another amazing question. And I think that, so here's the thing about movements, right? Movements are made up of different people in different small groups that come together for a specific cause. And oftentimes movements, they get started or they get springboarded from tragic circumstances like Mike Brown or George Floyd. And while I think that this is an amazing way to sort of start and become active or politically conscious, it doesn't sustain anything, right? Because what happens is after George Floyd, after we get some reform and after we get some new laws and we get some more scholarships, people are going to go back to their everyday lives. But there hasn't been organization throughout, right? And so like Abraham said, we need to create organizations both on the continent and in the diaspora that challenge oppression, that challenge white supremacy, that challenge capitalism, right? We need to look around our society, our community, and say, what is wrong in Ghana or Cameroon or Nigeria? And connect that to what's happening in the US. And I'll tell you all a quick story, and then I'll turn it over to my colleague Vincent. So the first time I came, again, dating myself, okay? So don't tell nobody. Listen, don't tell nobody my age, ladies and gentlemen. Actually, you can tell people, I don't care. I came to Ghana first in the 90s, and I came to Ghana as a Black nationalist, because I was only concerned about Black people in America, because that is who I was exposed to, right? And I said, Black people in America, they're oppressed, they're being mass incarcerated, they're being shot by the police, they don't have access to employment, there's still remnants of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery in our communities, right? There's the crack epidemic, all of these things I'm thinking. I left the US. and I touched down in Ghana. And as much as I love Ghana, I love Ghana, I love Ghana, I saw the same conditions in Ghana that I saw in the US. And I started to say, wait a minute, something is wrong. I see lack of employment. I see Ghanaian people don't control their resources. I see that women are as oppressed as women are in the US. I see that there's maybe not mass incarceration, but there's certainly police brutality. I see that there's corruption. I see all of this. I see the people don't have access to education equally. I see girl child education being very low. I mean, I see everything that's beyond comprehension. I see the IMF and World Bank and Structural Adjustment Program telling Ghana and Ghanaians how that they should manage their lives, how they should put in pay for the healthcare system, and people are dying of things like hypertension and diabetes and HIV and stuff and diseases that are curable, right? I see all of this, and I begin to say, wait a minute, there's some connection to what's happening in the US and what's happening in Ghana, right? And then I begin to say, I have to draw the dots and draw the connections between what's happening in Ghana and the US and Brazil, where Black and brown people are being killed as we speak in Brazil, in Colombia, where Afro-Colombians could not even identify as being African until the late 1990s. So I think that what we have to do is we have to organize locally with the things that are happening in our areas, and we need to say, is this connected to capitalism, and is this connected to African people in other places? And then we have to draw connections. That's the beauty of the internet, right? We have to draw connections. Vincent is here from St. Louis. Me, I'm in Accra. Someone is somewhere else. Blah blah blah. We need to draw connections between these movements. And last thing that I'll say. In the St. Louis, and Vincent, you may be more familiar with this, during the Mike Brown protests, right, the rebellions in St. Louis, the U.S. military and police, they were using tear gas. The very same tear gas that was made in Israel. I know some people get upset, but I'm just saying, let's just keep it real. That's used in Israel. I'm sorry, not that's made in Israel, that's made in Pennsylvania. Palestinians were tweeting to protesters in St. Louis about what to do if they got attacked with tear gas. That's solidarity right there. So how do we move beyond what's happening in our own community to say, I have a stake what's happening in the US and I have a stake what's happening in Nigeria? That's it.
That's great. I'm gonna let that one just sit so that we can maybe get to another question.
Okay, sure, no problem. Thank you so much, Mjiva, for that response, and a lot of steps on how to really move forward and not just stay in the protest mode. And we have a question from Josephine. She's asking, does the economic status of Africans in general contribute to Africans being marginalized globally? Like the quote, he who pays the piper determines the tune. How can we have and support more African people in high economic or top global businesses and political levels to represent and drive policies towards absolute Black freedom? So basically Black businesses and how they can help in this movement. Yeah.
Can I just, I'll let you speak on the African piece because I don't have that context at all. But what I can say here is there is a huge push of Blacks supporting Black-owned businesses, right? And that's the next piece of this work. And we also talk about systemically, right? And so, this could possibly come back to Dr. Williams, one of his initial question to me as well. I'm also wanting to have a conversation with our, our CFO, Chief Financial Officer, right? And this whole idea of procurement, right? With whom does the university do business, right? There are Black accountants, there are Black landscaping companies, there are Black, how do we invest our dollars in helping to increase viability of Black-owned businesses as well, right? It's one thing for me to go to the Black restaurant, right, and order, whatever they're selling, right? And it's small, it's definitely impactful for that family, right? But there's a whole nother level when we're talking about a multi-million-dollar contract, a multi-million-dollar deal with a Black accounting firm, right? That right there is life changing. That right there, if a major university is your client, then that allows and opens up the door for you to gain other clients, right? Which allows for your business to grow. And we know that that is how wealth is accumulated and amassed, right? Is we have to have good, solid business practices, right? And those opportunities must be presented. And so that's a piece for me that I'd like for us here in the States to also think about: how do we choose to exercise the use of our dollars? And that's, at the end of the day, that dollar is power, and it grants access and opportunities in such great ways.
Can I just ask a quick question on that? I had heard, Vincent, that there was going to be something like a blackout for 1 week in America. And I wanted to find out if you could talk a little bit about that. And did that actually happen?
It is scheduled to happen, as I understand. I just heard of this last night as my barber and I were talking. The week of July, it's the first week in July. I think he said 6th, 7th, and 6th through 9th, right? July 6th through 9th, right? And we are encouraged not to spend any money. I'm torn on things like that, right? Because what I envision happening, if it starts on the 6th, and that means on July 5th, I'm going out to go spend all my money to buy all the stuff so that I don't need to go during the 6th through the 9th.
Right.
The impact, I'm just moving my dollars from Tuesday to Monday, but my dollars are still being spent, right? And I hate to say this, but these are some of the challenges that we have. Is, the question about sustainability and the movement. That means you got to stick with the movement.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that the plan is that we're not spending dollars. And that means the plan is we're not spending dollars so that we can have that impact. And I think that, unfortunately, for so many of us, we don't see the bigger picture. We don't have our eyes fully on the prize, and we don't necessarily keep true to all the tactics that get us there, right? Mm-hmm. And it becomes a matter of individual piece. And, I want to go, I know that I'm having, my partner's birthday is during that time. And so, I know my partner's going to want to have, crab legs and all of that. And so I'm going to go buy those now. Whereas the partner needs to be like, no, we're going to be committed to it. And it's kind of like the COVID, right? Like here in the States, masks, we should all have that commitment for the good of the community, right? I wear a mask, not just because of me, but I wear a mask because I don't want my neighbor to get ill either, right? And there's that commitment. We don't have those levels of commitment, unfortunately, to even making change for our own selves and for the good of ourselves.
Yeah, and one can argue that slavery was designed to do that.
That's right.
I'll hand it over to Dr. Mjiba on that one.
Yes, I agree, and I'll be very brief in this because I wanted to raise the financial point, or having financial independence from the from the continent's perspective. And I would love Dr. Williams' thoughts, or anyone else's thoughts on this. But I think that's a really important point. We have to have economic independence. And let's use Ghana, for example, or Nigeria, or anywhere else. Why is it we're importing rice? Why is it we're importing chickens? Why is it we're importing cars? Can we not now, maybe we can't manufacture cars, no problem. I get it. We do have Katanka, but that's a whole different issue. But can we not, did we not grow rice? Did we not raise chickens? Did we not, did we not rear, beef or whatever? We need to begin to take our food sovereignty seriously. We need to begin to take our internal entrepreneur spirit and innovation seriously. Sekou Touré always has said that it's more important to have an entire nation with a 6th grade education than a couple people with PhDs, because your entire nation can develop if everyone has access to innovative education. Your intelligentsia, who's on this call right now, you are the next line of development in Africa. So the question that the challenge that I have to you all is, one, how are you developing Africa? Both your community, the nation, and the continent, in your profession and in your personal life, personal lives. And two, we need to begin to demand that we find food sovereignty, that we stop importing toothpicks, that we begin to develop industry inside the continent. And that means sometimes, I'm sorry to say, but sometimes it means not wearing Nikes. Sometimes it means wearing made in Ghana clothes. You know, sometimes it means not being popular. Sometimes, you know, but that's okay though, because our small decision today is going to impact us in 100 years. And so I definitely think that that's a critical point. We need to start having a conversation with inside. And the last thing I'm going to say, and this may take a while, but I want us to be real clear about this, that the moment that you peg your currency to the US dollar, your currency has no value. Look at us now in Ghana. Look at the Naira. You know, how much the one Naira to $1 is, how many CDs. You can go to a Forex bureau or change in the black market, 6, 7 CDs to $1 if you're on the black market. That devalues your salary. It takes every CD out of your pocket because you want to go buy bread and your bread is twice how much it was a week ago. You can't buy bread. You want to go and invest in a company, but you can't invest because you needed 10,000 CDs, but last week you needed 7,000 CDs, right? And that's because we're pegging, and I understand it's a global market, but that's because we're pegging our currency to the US dollar. And let's be clear that when you peg your currency to someone else's currencies in a global market, if you are not a power player or a power broker, you are always at the losing end of the stick. And I'll say it like this. You need to go to school and you don't have any money. And you go to a relative or a neighbor and you say, relative or neighbor, I need to go to school. I don't have any money. They say, no problem. I'll give you money. But what you have to do is you have to major in medicine. You have to pay me back 200% of what you borrowed. When you get out, you have to also give me 50% of your salary for 5 years. That's not a benefit to you. You're beholden to that neighbor or family member who paid your tuition to go through school. This is exactly where Africa finds herself today. We need to slowly begin to change that so we can stop being dependent on imports and the global market. Thank you very much.
Oh, can I add something just for a second? I can't stress the importance of what Njibla has said is so important. Africa's food bill is $35 billion a year. And this is from a continent that could serve as a breadbasket of the entire world. It's so critical. In fact, Ghana, 57% of Ghana's land that can grow food, covers the whole Ghana, 57%. But yet we import $2.4 billion in food. So I think that's critical. If people control your stomach, they'll control you. But if I just want to switch gears for a second and ask Vincent something that's related to our students who want to come to St. Louis so much. Vincent, I think you grew up in St. Louis, I think. Am I not
That's correct? Yes.
Yeah,
correct.
I remember that. And so there's a relatively new book out called The Broken Heart of America, St. Louis and the Violent History of the U.S. I don't know if you've seen it. It's relatively new. Yeah, you should get by a guy named Walter Johnson, The Broken Heart of America, St. Louis and the Violent History of the U.S. So I guess what I'm getting at is St. Louis atypical or typical? I mean, does St. Louis, is there a history of, I mean, his whole point is that St. Louis has such a racist history. I mean, it's not so much greater than anywhere else, but he's just showing example after example, all kind of race riots and stuff. And I remember also hearing from this lady, she's called the Black Mother of Hollywood, Jennifer Lewis, who's a graduate of Webster. And she grew up in St. Louis also, and talks about how racist it is. So many of our students want to get to St. Louis. Should they be concerned? Is there any issues that's different in St. Louis compared to any other city? Yeah, what's your take on that?
Dr. Williams, this is what I think on that. It's kind of like, St. Louis, yes, it's racist, but we're watching America is racist. We have Atlanta, Atlanta is the Black Mecca of America, right? And we have, I mean, I'm hopeful that you all have seen the news events that have taken place there as well, right? You have the police chief who resigned because, you know, her officer, who was white, because her officer, you know, which is interesting, right? You have a largely Black population, you have a white police chief, right? And she resigns because her officers, you know, end up tasing 2 Black collegians, right? And then, you know, like, it's just over and over and over. You have Minneapolis, you have Chicago, you have—
It's America.
It's America. It's America. And as a lifelong St. Louis, and to be honest, I get a little bit of offended in the folks trying to say that it's just such a racist place. It's like being pregnant. You either are pregnant or you're not pregnant. And America is racist, period. There's no degree of level of racism. It is what it is, right? And it is what it is, right? And so that's a question that for me is just hard, you know, but at the end of the day, for our students who are there, who are desiring to come here, I certainly would encourage them to come here, regardless of that experience, right? I would caution them in terms of being prepared and what it looks like, right? It can be incredibly subtle. You know, we don't see people walking around in KKK hats and flying the Confederate flag here in St. Louis generally, right? And you know, you might be in Missouri and you might drive to a small town and you'll see somebody with a Confederate flag waving over their yard, right?
That's right.
But it is not as in your face, blatant, right? It's that those subtleties. It's the way in which they might speak to you. It might be the way in which, and this is, again, I think across the country, right? It's not unique to St. Louis, but it might be like, oh, you are so articulate, right? That's a level of, you know, what we call microaggression. That's a level of racism. That's embedded in racism in the fact that because I speak well, you are really surprised that as a Black person, I could speak so well, right? Or, wow, you all have, you're a doctor, like you have a PhD, right? Like, wow, you all are really smart. Black folks aren't supposed to be able to be smart, right? Like, it's that level of stuff, I think, that is much more prevalent than the straight up overt pieces, right? The police brutality is an issue that is certainly embedded in racism. And, you know, one of the things about the police in America, you know, police in America it was formalized as a way of actually patrolling slaves, right? And the ways in which, when slaves were runaway slaves, the police were the ones who went out and rounded them up, right? And obviously were violent. And I think that is a part of their system still today, that mentality, right? That code of ethics of not calling it out for one another. When you witness it being wrong, you don't say anything because you are afraid that you won't have anyone to go to lunch with and sit in your police cruiser at the Dunkin' Donuts, right? And so I just feel as if, and I really do believe this, racism is an American situation, institution, period. And I don't care which town, hamlet, city, state you're in, you're going to experience it on a level.
I hear you. Well said.
Thank you.
Interesting enough, that point you mentioned where you said, oh, well, you speak this way or you speak that way. Our colleague who's on this call right now, Philomena Abaka, mentioned to us just last week that when she was in Canada recently, someone said to her, oh, you can speak English. I mean, and she was so incredibly appalled. And other colleague, Martha Queno Amankwa, I believe also mentioned the same. So it's spread across the world. I mean, the United States, yes, we're here to talk about that especially. But I mean, our own African brothers and sisters go out to the West and encounter this in other ways too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that because we had just spoken about this in our office within the last practically 48 hours.
And to that point, you look, you see what's happening around the world in response to the killing of George Floyd. not all of it is just because it's George Floyd. Some of it is because those countries are having their own issues as well, right? And people are saying enough is enough with police brutality.
Yeah, absolutely. The statues are coming down, basically.
The statues are coming down. Here in St. Louis, actually, this was really interesting. Just this week, we have a park that had a statue of Columbus, and it's not a public park. It's owned by an entity. It's open to the public, however, and there had been a call for that statue to come down, and finally they agreed this week that it would come down, and it came down. But what we found was that actually it's one of the very few remaining, it made it like to the New York Times or something like this, one of the very few remaining statues in America actually of Christopher Columbus. Many of them have already come down. And we, to your point also, Dr. Williams, we sometimes hold on to those vestiges really long too, right? But you go all throughout the Confederate States and you see Virginia, they're starting to lower theirs as well. But I'm sorry, I'm just going.
It shows us that we need this conversation. This conversation is so critical, and to have it on a day like this means everything.
For sure.
Go ahead, Adelina. I think you wanted to chime in.
Sorry, I thought everybody was done, but if I just wanted to we already ran a bit over, so I just wanted to pick the last question. I see two questions that are quite similar. They're talking about the disconnect between African Americans and Africans on the continent, and basically, I'll take the last one because it goes like, there's a disconnect between Black Americans and Africans because there's a sort of discrimination from Black Americans, Africans, although that doesn't always apply. So basically, we're looking at how we can address that disconnect. What can we do as Africans and also Black and African Americans, and even what's the root of the disconnect, and how can we come together to kind of work and solve that disconnect, and maybe explain more if anyone has anything. But I feel like that might be the last question. I'm sorry, everyone, but yeah, I think that's a very important question. So I want us to just, how can we fix that disconnect? And before we answer, I would appreciate it if everyone puts on their camera for a quick photo op. We'll be taking some photos during this discussion, this last question. So please, if you can, please put on your photos so we see your amazing faces. Thank you.
So I think I'll take that if that's fine, Vincent.
Of course.
But I'm going to be very brief because I have a habit of being longer than I should. I think that is like one of the most critical questions that we should raise, and quite frankly, what I believe it's a disconnect both ideologically, and then also there's a misunderstanding of the historical links between the continent and the diaspora, right? And for example, and that's because we all are subject to, whether we're in the continent or on the diaspora, we're all subject to neo-colonial education. Ultimately, someone else is creating the features and curriculum of our education, and it's not African-centered, it's not decolonial. And so what you have in a place like Ghana, for example, where you have a Elmina slave dungeon or a Cape Coast slave dungeon, you have Ghanaians that live in Cape Coast and have not been inside the slave dungeon and don't truly have a grasp of the historical relevance of that slave dungeon. And that's because of a lack of African-centered education, right? And then you can let me just say this, we went to PanaFest this year, 2019, and we interviewed people, right? And we interviewed both Ghanaians and diasporans. And we asked diasporans, why were you here? They were so excited. Oh, I'm here, I'm coming back home, I'm an African, I'm this, I'm that, I'm so woohoo, life is great. And then we interviewed some Ghanaians, and they were like, as for me, I don't know much about this PanaFest thing, but I do know I can come and I can sell my wares, or I can sell water. Or those Black people from the US, they come, and when they come, they buy from me. PanaFest, I don't really even know what it's about. Now, here's the thing, that tells you there's a lack of education, right? Now, on the other side, okay, The U.S., you go to U.S. educational schools, and I've told this story before. Dr. Williams has known me since I've been a wee thing, right? And when I was coming to Ghana the first time, I was writing some letter, and I was like, please, I'm going to Africa. Give me some money so I can afford my ticket. I didn't have any money. And someone asked me, but where in Africa are you going? And I said, I don't know. I'm going to Africa. Like, I couldn't pick Ghana out on a map.
Yeah.
I couldn't tell you how many countries were in Africa. I couldn't tell you the man called Kwame Nkrumah. If you asked me what a Ghanaian was, I wouldn't have known because I went through public education in the U.S. And because in the U.S., the only education you get about Black or African people is a paragraph of slavery during Black History Month. And so that's why there's a disconnect. And so what we have to do as people who have access to knowledge is we have to bridge that gap, right? We have to talk about the way forward. And I know I said I was going to be brief, but I just want to tell one more story. Was it Africana Studies or was it social movements? One class we had last semester. Some people who were in my class know the story I'm about to tell. So we started out talking about the transatlantic slave trade. One student asked, probably not innocently, she said, I don't understand why people are crying about slavery. We have to get over slavery because it happened back in the day. Before I could open my mouth, every student in the room, and by the way, there was not a diasporan student in the room. Every student in the room, besides the young lady, pounced on her and said, what are you talking about? Slavery is important, and we got to talk about this, and there are brothers and sisters and X, Y, and Z. It literally took me 35 minutes to get the room calm back again. Because students who had taken Africana Studies, who had taken Dr. Williams' Pan-Africanism class, who had engaged with the African students who came from the US, recognized the connection between the diaspora and the continent. And so I'm saying that to say that once we recognize those connections, then we advocate on behalf of those connections. And we learn and we learn and we learn. And that's how we move. That's how we bridge the gap.
Sign me up. That's exactly it, right? And I will underscore your point about my ignorance of the continent, right? Because as you said, that's not what's taught here. It's not what's taught here. And conversely, I would imagine that our lived experience outside of slavery and the civil rights is not taught there, right? And we see there's that huge disconnect, right? We've talked about this before while we were on campus there with you all. You know, it could be considered an insult for folks to say in America, Black folks to talk among themselves, you know, they would insult each other to say that, oh, you're African or you look African, right? And they would take that as an insult, right? Back to your point also, Krista, like that's what slavery did. Like it put this wedge between us,
right? And
we continue to apply pressure to it ourselves versus the idea of actually alleviating that pressure and recognizing our commonality and trying to figure out how do we support one another, right? Mm-hmm. And sadly, not only does that then happen across, but it happens internally too, right? And you all see it, you know, as you all compare your countries and your nationalities against one another as well, right? And we do it because I'm light skinned, you're dark skinned, because I have an education, I have an AKA, or I have a Delta, or I have a Q, or I'm a Kappa, or whatever it is, right? And we fight each other. We fight each other. Right. And again, some of this was intentional. This was intentional stuff. So how do we undo that? How do we have to bridge it. We have to intentionally say, let me get to know, Kim Smith is on this right here, Learlard Lewis, right? Let me be able to connect with them through technology, if that's what it is now. I mean, here I am in St. Louis at, you know, it's 10 o'clock in the morning, right? I can get up at 10 o'clock in the morning and connect with somebody in Ghana and have a conversation and get to know, right? And it's all about relationship. And I also think relationship matters in all of this. Relationship matters for white folks getting to know people of color, Black folks, and getting to know their stories so that they then can actually have that personal connection and know someone's real story and not just say, oh, I have a Black friend. No, you really have a Black friend and you're touched. And you're touched when that Black friend is sick. And you're touched when that Black friend experiences racism. And you're touched when that Black friend loses a mother, right? It's that relationship piece also.
Thank you so much. I mean, this conversation is a heavy one. It's a critical one, as we said. So thank you for all you have shared to our presenters and then everyone who has joined. I want to thank Adelina for working so hard to put this program together. We didn't have much time, but we knew that this had to be recognized. And I know that Adelina is going to probably close the program, or Dr. Williams. I don't recall what we had said or agreed to, but I just want to thank, our students, staff, and faculty for joining this important conversation and realizing that it does matter and Black lives do matter. I really, really appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to all the discussions that we're going to have moving forward. And I'm very proud that this campus is beginning that conversation within the Webster network, outside of the work that Vincent and his team and our Black faculty, students, and staff have already done with administration back in the US. I'm really grateful that our university stands for Black Lives Matter, that we believe in discussions that focus on social justice issues, and that we are for equity and racial equality. It means a lot to be part of a university that stands for those important values, working towards correcting the wrongs, if you will, as Vincent mentioned before. It's a journey. It's not something that's going to be done overnight, but I think this is the first important step. And as I've been mentioning, for those looking at the chat on the side, please, please, pretty please turn on your videos, because we want to recognize this moment as a moment in history for our campus and for this day. And I'm also hoping and praying that the country that I was born, United States, will recognize Juneteenth as a federal holiday. July 4th does not have the same meaning for me and any Black person, I think, in the world, and particularly the United States, without the recognition of Juneteenth. And I'm hopeful that we are moving in that direction. So that is what I wanted to share, and I'm still asking people to turn on their videos. I'll hand it over to Adelina as to how you wanted to close the program. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us. And I hope that we've actually taken time to really understand what we learned today. We learned about the importance of education, learning. We need to educate ourselves about what's happening around us. We need to bridge the gap, relationship. Vincent kept on saying relationships. We need to connect. We need to push for Black-owned businesses, support our own. We need to come together as a continent and push for Pan-Africanism. We need to see the value of us being together and just building those bridges and understanding the history, understanding the impact of history on our situations right now. And we need to really understand that Black lives do matter. Every single second of the day, Black lives matter. And as a sign of us showing that we support Black power and Black lives, can we just have the fist? And Abigail is going to take a quick picture. Abigail, please, I want everybody to hold a fist for about a minute. So to about please hold a fist up and let's do this. Let's see. If you all want to say Black Lives Matter, I'll appreciate it. On the 1, 2, 3, let's go.
Black Lives Matter.
Wait, let's do this again. Please unmute your mics now. Let's just unmute the mics and then on the 1, 2, 3, let's go. Black Lives
Matter.
Black Lives Matter.
Black Lives
Thank
Matter.
you so much. Thank you. One more time. 1, 2.
Black Lives Matter.
you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Vincent. Thank you, Eva, for such information and for educating us. And really thank everybody for staying on. I know we went longer than we supposed to.
Eva.
Really
Thank
appreciate you all.
Thank you.
Hope we
Thank
learned
you.
a lot. Yeah, so the rest of and happy everyone.
Good job.
Bye. Thank you
Dr.
so
Williams,
much.
good to see
Bye.
you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Same here, Vincent. Stay safe, Vincent.
Bye.
FJ.
Bye. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you. Thank you, SJ.
Forever.
Love you,
Thank
Webster.
you, Susan. Thank you, Francis.
Register
Thank you,
for
Mark.
my classes. Register for my classes.
Yes, please. Please, I agree. Can we audit?
Hi, Vincent.
You guys, Krista, thank you so much.
Thank you, Chef. Stay on. Stay on with us for a little bit. Stay on.
Is this
Okay.
Chef?
Yeah, hey, how you doing, boss?
Hey, we want to be able to say a few words. I'd like for the presenters and the organizers to stay on. Everyone else, you can certainly log out if you like. If there are staff who would also like to stay on, I see Abba. Abba, perhaps you representing the students. As the president of the SGA, please stay on. And others are free to leave. All right. Well, I just want to say thank you for this wonderful program. We had said we wanted to do this no matter what, and we were able to pull it off in a very short period of time. I know that this is still being recorded, so I don't know who's in charge of recording. Is that you, Adelina?
No, it's Abigail. Let me just tell her to stop recording.
Stop the recording so that we can just have